Welcome to NTD Newsroom. I'm Don Meng. President Trump with his plans for Greenland and the president launching his Board of Peace on his second day in Davos. Former special counsel Jack Smith testified in a public setting before Congress on his investigations into President Trump. Lawmakers expressed concern over the surveillance of their phone records by the former special counsel. Multiple people have been arrested after activists disrupted a church service in Minnesota. Jason Blair has the latest. Today, a congressional task force explored why the federal government hasn't been transparent about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. The U.S. officially leaving the World Health Organization, why this matters, and what this means for the U.S. and the future of the WHO.
This is NTD Newsroom, live from our global headquarters in New York City.
President Trump laying out his plans for the future of Greenland. This comes after he cancels threatened tariffs on European nations over Greenland's acquisition, and the president launching the Board of Peace on his second day in Davos. Here is Washington correspondent Mario Otsu, who was at the launch in Davos today.
President Trump last night, after a meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Davos, said that a framework trade deal had been reached on Greenland. The president also then canceled those threatened tariffs on European nations over the acquisition of Greenland. And today, President Trump says the deal is still being negotiated, but that it is long-term and that there is no time limit to the acquisition. Take a look.
Well, I'm not going to have to pay anything. We're going to have total access to Greenland.
President Trump says the emerging Greenland deal includes all the military access the U.S. wants and comes at no cost. He says the deal will also allow the U.S. to install part of his Golden Dome, a multi-billion-dollar missile defense system on the island, citing that missile accuracy will improve with part of the dome on Greenland's strategic location.
So the Golden Dome will be on Greenland?
A piece of it, yes, and it's a very important part because it's everything comes over Greenland. If the bad guys start shooting, it comes over Greenland.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that the president firmly believes the U.S. should not outsource its national security.
Greenland's becoming more and more attractive for foreign conquest, and he very strongly believes that it must be part of the United States to prevent a conflict.
Greenland is a vast, almost entirely uninhabited and undeveloped territory, sitting undefended in a key strategic location between the United States, Russia, and China. Those missiles would be flying right over the center of that piece of ice.
President Trump's also urging the necessity of tariffs for national security and identity, framing his tariff strategy as a way to keep foreign influence at bay without cost to the U.S. consumer.
If they think that, like, the Chinese have inelastic supply to the U.S., so they're going to just keep dumping their stuff no matter what, then they really, really care about the tariffs. And so the fact that countries move so much when the president threatens tariffs says something about, like, who's bearing the tariff, right?
This comes as the president unveils the Board of Peace on his last day in Davos, saying that it could couple with the United Nations.
This board has the chance to be one of the most consequential bodies ever created.
He says the board will start with a focus on rebuilding Gaza before looking globally.
And the President of the United States is a president of action. It is our destiny if we put the time and the effort that it requires, as I know this board will do. But I also think it will serve as an example of what's possible in other parts of the world. Without losing focus on what's before us now, this is what's possible for other places and other conflicts that seem impossible to solve right now.
And the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, then laid out a plan for the next steps to rebuild Gaza, starting with security and the demilitarization of Hamas. President Trump also today met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the World Economic Forum, the White House saying that the meeting lasted around an hour. And on his way out of that, President Trump said to us that it went well, that the meeting was good. And Zelensky then announced that the first trilateral meeting between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine will take place tomorrow in the United Arab Emirates. Reporting from Zurich, Mario Otsu, NTD News.
France intercepted a sanctioned oil tanker from Russia in the Mediterranean earlier today. French President Emmanuel Macron announced the Navy operation on social media platform X. Macron said the tanker was subject to international sanctions and suspected of flying a false flag. He said the operation was carried out this morning with the help of several allies. A judicial investigation has been opened and the vessel has been diverted. The French president said France is determined to uphold international law and to ensure the effective enforcement of sanctions. He added that the activities of the Shadow Fleet contribute to the financing of the war in Ukraine, and France will not tolerate sanction violations. President Trump saying he had a good meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky today. The Ukrainian leader now touting plans for the first trilateral meeting with Russia since the start of the war. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pasdar has more.
The meeting was good with President Zelensky. We'll see how it turns out.
President Trump saying he had a good meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky at the sidelines of the World Economic Forum. Zelensky says Trump has the means to stop the fighting in Ukraine.
He really can, because he has dialogue with Putin. Not everybody has dialogue, just even dialogue. He has dialogue with Putin on the same levels. I think America is much stronger than Russia, and that's why I think he can do this.
Trump didn't give many details on the outcomes of the meeting with Zelensky. He suggested details still have to be worked out. Trump added that the next step is for Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday. Also on Thursday, Zelensky announced plans for the first trilateral meeting since the start of the war. He says US, Ukrainian and Russian officials are set to meet in the Middle East.
It will be the first trilateral meeting in Emirates. It will be tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Yes, it will be 2 days meetings in Emirates.
Zelensky added that he's not yet sure if the meeting will take place in the Emirates, as plans often change last minute. Arian Pasdar, NTD News.
President Trump said the United States is negotiating an arrangement to secure full access to Greenland. Joining us to discuss this is Armin Kurdian, retired U.S. Navy captain and foreign policy and national security analyst. So Armin, good afternoon. I have a clip here with me of Trump talking about the Greenland deal. So I just want you to quickly take a look at this.
Essentially, it's total access. There's no end. There's no time limit. We're going to have total access to Greenland. We're going to have all military access that we want. So we're going to not have to pay anything other than the fact that we are building the Golden Dome.
Now, Armin, if in this deal the U.S. does not actually own Greenland, I mean, would it achieve, in your view, the national security goals the U.S. had in mind in countering China and Russia?
Well, good afternoon, Don. First of all, I would not characterize this actually as a deal. This framework is based off of the discussion he had with the NATO Secretary General. The Danish government has made very clear that they weren't necessarily part of this discussion, so whatever happens is going to require the Danes' approval and negotiation and working with them. Now, if the president doesn't own Greenland, he doesn't have to own Greenland. We just need access to certain areas, perhaps building additional bases, military enforcement, working with the native Greenlanders and the Danish government and NATO to secure the island against, to help secure the Western Hemisphere against Chinese and Russian aggression or their access to the Arctic. The NATO Secretary General agrees in principle to a lot of the things that Trump has wanted to say. But as excited as I was when we heard we had a framework of a deal, the more I kind of dialed into it, I think Trump was trying to dial it back a little bit and perhaps open up the door to some more negotiations. But there is still a very long way to go on this.
Okay, so you're saying in this framework that a strong U.S. presence in Greenland is essentially strong enough to stop China and Russia from continuing their military presence there, or even increasing it.
A strong NATO presence with the U.S. Primarily supporting, considering it is our hemisphere, would be great. Whether that includes increased port facilities on the East Coast, whether that includes additional radar facilities to identify, perhaps target incoming missiles coming over the Arctic Circle, or additional deep water ports on the East Coast, because the northern coast of Greenland is not conducive to deep water ports. It's iced over a big part of the year, and the water is just not deep enough for large ships to come in. But additional patrols or the ability to extend security through the Greenland-Iceland-Europe gap, where Russian subs come in and out to be monitored. All of these things are central to not only the U.S. security and Canadian security, but NATO security at the same time. So they're great ideas to actually go and do. And I applaud the president for wanting to make some serious progress here, because apparently in the past, some other presidents have tried to make this happen without much success. My concern or comments are on the tactics that he is using. I think a carrot approach in this sense would be a lot more effective than the stick approach he has been wielding.
Okay, so a lot still needs to be discussed. Right now, it's just a framework, as you and President Trump both said. But since we're talking about it, in terms of necessity, what does the U.S. actually need to gain in this potential agreement? What needs to be different from the current agreement, where the U.S. already has significant access to Greenland?
Well, there's access to Greenland, and then there's permanent presence in Greenland. Like I said, the ability to place a permanent radar facility there would be of great value. Whether or not interceptors on the Greenland island would be of use depends on the trajectory of missiles coming in over that area of the world. Monitoring Russian activity is very, very important. Having greater access to the Arctic. Remember, the United States builds 0.1% of the world's of our own maritime seagoing fleet. We don't build icebreakers here. We try, but we can't do it. Finland builds icebreakers. They're very, very good at it. A lot of other countries build ships. We don't build ships. So that partnership is also going to be very, very important in terms of shipbuilding and providing new ships that perhaps could be home ported in that part of the world. Pre-positioning, other kind of logistics information, our previous logistics space that we can use in case we need to help reinforce Scandinavia, or perhaps if there's Russian activity in the north, or they're trying to exploit mineral wealth under the ice, we would be there to be able to do that as well. So, access includes economic cooperation, includes government cooperation, includes military to military cooperation. That's what access really is. And then, of course, there's that question about rare earth materials, natural resources that we could all exploit, even though that is a little bit of a harder problem, or a tougher nut to crack, considering the fact that much of Greenland is frozen over. And whether or not it would be cost effective to try to pull a lot of that out of there, especially in the northern half of the island, that may be a little bit of a challenge. But there's still other resources that we could pull out in cooperation with the native Greenlanders, and of course in cooperation with the native population.
Okay, Armin, another topic here. President Trump unveiled his new international body called the Board of Peace at the World Economic Forum. And Trump even saying it could go beyond peace in Gaza and even replace the UN. So about the UN, it's important to mention that China, which runs counter to many U.S. interests, including religious freedom and fair trade, has a lot of influence in the UN, right? So, I mean, the regime persecutes its people. They're on the UN Human Rights Council. So what are your thoughts on what President Trump said about this Board of Peace? And what could it mean for the UN?
Well, the UN doesn't have necessarily the best record of peace in the Middle East, and it is very much there's a very strong anti-Israel sentiment that runs through the UN. So, can you really blame the president for wanting to create an independent body that might not necessarily govern the area, but a forum specifically towards development, de-escalation of military involvement, removal of Iranian influence in that area? There's a lot of positive things that can be done by this sort of independent board, independent governing body in that region of the world that the UN has not been able to do. In fact, the UN has, in a lot of ways, been an obstacle to peace within the Middle East. We say, well, the UN wants peace, the UN wants peace, yet Hamas, Hezbollah, and all the proxies have been allowed to continue. And the UN, in terms of like a military force or a force for good, is a bit of a joke. China is trying to influence all parts of the world with its Belt and Road Initiative. This is nothing new. They've been doing the same thing in the Middle East, trying to entrench themselves in a lot of these nations. These nations say, "Come on in," and then they can't pay back, and then China gets ownership of a lot of these areas, facilities that they put in. So it's very, very smart on the Chinese part. Hopefully, this board can use the United States and the European nations as more of that economic bulwark in the Middle East, because the last thing we want is a great Chinese presence or even a military presence in that region of the world.
And how do you feel about this organization managing Gaza's governance, security, and reconstruction simultaneously? Do the participating countries have unified or competing interests in the Middle East?
I'm sure they have some competing interests, but at the same time, a lot of these countries that have virtue signaled about the Palestinians over the last several decades, we'll see if they can put their money where their mouth is. At the end of the day, a lot of these countries that have a lot of oil wealth and sovereign wealth funds, they understand business. Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Oman, they understand what it means to invest and create jobs and basically continue to generate more wealth. And a lot of that wealth could potentially come from, outside the region in terms of tourism or in terms of other businesses that are coming in and finding, perhaps a workforce that could be highly trained and highly skilled in that area. Could you perhaps turn the Gaza Strip into something like, the United Arab Emirates did for their region of the world in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, a financial technological center in that region of the world that people are living. A lot of expatriates go and live in that region of the world. A lot of folks remember Beirut is a beautiful city. Now, granted, that's up in Lebanon, but that whole coastal area is a very, very beautiful area. People may want to live there. People may want to develop. Imagine of all that money that Iran gave to Hamas and for bombs and terrorist activities actually went into bettering the lives of the Palestinian people in a peaceful way. So the possibilities are endless. And I certainly have a lot more, let's say at least hope that this independent board can do a better job than the UN has done in the past.
Right. I mean, it's certainly it's certainly difficult to argue against the possibilities that are present because of this this board of peace. But thank you for speaking with us about this, Armin. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Don. Have a great day.
And that was NTD's Mari Otsu in Switzerland. Former special counsel Jack Smith testified before Congress in a public setting for the first time. Lawmakers grilled the attorney who investigated President Trump and whose work went as far as probing members of Congress. Our Washington correspondent Luis Eduardo Martinez has the details.
Democrats have been going after President Trump for 10 years, for a decade, and the country should never, ever forget what they did.
House Republicans argued that former special counsel Jack Smith's investigation into Donald Trump during the 2024 elections were part of the weaponization of government against the now president. For Chairman Jim Jordan, Jack Smith follows a long list of efforts that began with special counsel Robert Mueller, 2 impeachment attempts, a raid on the president's home, and the Alvin Bragg and Fani Willis criminal investigations.
Rather than accept his defeat in the 2020 election, President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results and prevent the lawful transfer of power. After leaving office in January of 21, President Trump illegally kept classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago social club.
Congressional Republicans whose phone records were surveilled by the FBI as part of Operation Arctic Frost at the request of former special counsel Jack Smith grilled the former special counsel on the legality of the surveillance.
They got my phone records for 2.5 years. Even the Democrats said this was wrong. But of course, we shouldn't be surprised. Democrats have been going after President Trump for 10 years.
House Democrats defended the former special counsel despite previous attempts to limit the DOJ's ability to subpoena congressional phone records.
Congress has allowed toll records to be subpoenaed. This committee has actually tried to limit it over the years, and the senators who are whining the most over on the Republican side in the Senate, they never went along with our determination to try to limit the government's ability to subpoena toll records. So it's perfectly lawful what you did.
House Republicans pressed former special counsel Smith on whether his investigation into President Trump during the 2024 elections were meant to hinder his chances at winning the elections.
So, Mr. Smith, looking at the record, I see that you were reversed and rebuked by the Department of Justice itself, by the Attorney General, by the Solicitor General, by multiple district court judges, by the Court of Appeals, and by the U.S. Supreme Court itself. So my final question is, Do you believe that you made any mistakes? Do you have any regrets as to how you conducted this investigation?
Jack Smith defended his investigations and called the probe into his work and his staff unjustified. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
This is NTD Newsroom, live from our global headquarters in New York City.
And welcome to NTD Newsroom. I'm Don Ma. You were just watching Jack Smith testifying in a hearing with Republicans saying he weaponized the justice system and Democrats saying he acted within the law. We're going to move on now to Vice President J.D. Vance in Minneapolis today, joining a roundtable with local leaders as the state undergoes a federal immigration crackdown. Let's take a look.
All we need is a little cooperation. I guarantee we're going to do the best to be professional, to respect people's rights, to not do anything that we don't have to do in order to enforce immigration laws, but it would make our lives a lot easier, it would make our officers a lot safer, and it would make Minneapolis much less chaotic if we had a little bit of cooperation from the state and local officials. With that, I'll shut up and take some questions. Thank you, guys.
Vice President Vance, a local school district here is alleging ICE agents detaining a 5-year-old after preschool on Tuesday. We've also seen multiple American citizens detained by ICE or harassed by ICE in the last 6 weeks. Are you proud of how your administration is conducting this immigration crackdown here in Minnesota right now?
Well, I'm proud of the fact that we're standing behind law enforcement, and I'm proud of the fact that we're enforcing the country's laws. But, you know, you asked a question about this 5-year-old kid. I actually saw this terrible story while I was coming to Minneapolis. We just left Toledo, Ohio this morning for an economic messaging event. And I see this story, and I'm a father of a 5-year-old, actually, a 5-year-old little boy, and I think to myself, oh my God, this is terrible. How did we arrest a 5-year-old? Well, I do a little bit more follow-up research. And what I find is that the 5-year-old was not arrested, that his dad was an illegal alien, and then when they went to arrest his illegal alien father, the father ran. So the story is that ICE detained a 5-year-old. Well, what are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to let a 5-year-old child freeze to death? Are they not supposed to arrest an illegal alien in the United States of America? If the argument is that you can't arrest people who have violated our laws because they have children, then every single parent is going to be completely given immunity from ever being the subject of law enforcement. That doesn't make any sense. No one thinks that makes any sense. Now, you know, there are so many of these cases like that where if you just understand the context, there have been a number of situations that I've looked into personally where I say, wait a second, we don't want ICE arresting American citizens. They're supposed to be enforcing the immigration laws against illegal aliens. So then I look into it and I find out that the American citizen who was arrested took a swing at an ICE officer. You can't have that happen. And of course they have to defend themselves. And of course they have the right to detain somebody who assaults a law enforcement officer. Now, this is my point. Do we want these things to happen? Do we want these arrests to be so chaotic? No, we don't. These guys want it least of all, but if we had a little cooperation from local and from local and state officials, I think the chaos would go way down in this community.
President!
Go ahead.
After the Renee Good shooting, sir, the administration seemed to suggest...
Yeah, well, you can go next.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I thought you pointed it
No,
out.
that's fine. I'll take both.
After the Renee Good shooting, sir, the administration seemed to... After the Renee Good shooting, the administration seemed to suggest that ICE officers enjoyed near complete immunity. But today you told the Washington Examiner that when appropriate, the administration might take disciplinary actions against ICE agents. So is that a change of opinion? And if so, why the change in tone?
No, I didn't say, and I don't think any other official within the Trump administration said that officers who engaged in wrongdoing would enjoy immunity. That's absurd. What I did say is that when federal law enforcement officers violate the law, that is typically something that federal officials would look into. We don't want these guys to have kangaroo courts. We want them to actually have real due process, real investigation, because again, sometimes they're accused of wrongdoing, and it turns out when you learn the context, they didn't actually do anything wrong. But of course we're going to investigate these things. Of course we're investigating the Renee Good shooting, but we're investigating them in a way that respects people's rights and that ensures that if somebody did something wrong, yes, they're going to face disciplinary action, but we're not going to judge them in the court of public opinion. I've spoken at length on this particular case. I think that Renee Good's death is a tragedy. I also think that she rammed an ICE officer with her car. So the tragedy here is multi-layered. The tragedy is there was a misunderstanding. The tragedy is that Renee Good lost her life. The tragedy is that you have ICE officers who are going into communities where they're worried that if they call 911, no one's going to come to help them. That is what produces this terrible situation, and it's something state and local officials here in Minnesota could solve. Yes, sir.
Could you give us a message towards March for Life tomorrow, especially regarding this cooperation and family values? It's a shame the kids have to get caught up in all this, and towards that.
Well, it is a shame that kids have to get caught up in this. I am speaking at March for Life tomorrow. I'm pro-life, and I'm very excited to speak there. I want to talk about local law enforcement, but I am. As a child, I saw people in my family get arrested. It's terrible. It's heartbreaking, it's chaotic, it's traumatic for the kids. I can recognize that, and I can recognize that we got to support these kids, while on the other hand saying that just because you're a parent doesn't mean that you get complete immunity from law enforcement. And I think we have to hold both of those thoughts in our head at the same time. We've got to be sympathetic to the kids who are caught up in some of these enforcement actions. We've also got to say we have to enforce the law without bias, with fairness, but we've got to enforce the law.
Mr. Vice President! Speaking about local government, there was a clash in St. Cloud roughly a week ago, and their mayor said they haven't heard about ICE being in the city. And how does ICE kind of proactively work with these local agencies? What are those policies, and what's your response to that allegation?
You said there was an altercation in St. Cloud. Yeah.
The incident, the mayor said that ICE did not communicate with them that they were in the city for a major operation. The police chief did not know about the operation at the time. Could you talk a little bit about proactive communication with local law enforcement?
Yeah, it's one of the takeaways. I've talked with these guys before we came on the stage, but during our roundtable and some of the other conversations we've had, communication, we absolutely want to ensure there's good communication between federal officials and state and local officials, and I'm sure that we can do better on that. We absolutely want to make sure that we are communicating, but that also requires a two-way street, and that's the point that I make about state and local officials. These guys will absolutely communicate with state and local officials. They'll tell people if they have to do an enforcement operation in a particular municipality, but part of that is they also want to ensure that if they're communicating about their whereabouts, that's not being used as a weapon against them. Sometimes they tell people where they're going, and then they find out that their agents' faces are on on Reddit or on some social media thread saying, here's this guy, we know he's going to be at this place at this exact time. So that communication has got to be a two-way street. These guys are going to communicate with business leaders, with local officials, with state officials, but we also need the local officials and state officials to do a good job of protecting people when they're in their communities. We're not asking, by the way, we don't want any police officer in this community, in this state, to help us do immigration enforcement. We've got that. But if a protester shows up and that protester turns violent against our immigration officers, we really, really need the cooperation of our local partners. We haven't gotten it yet, but I think if we do, we really can lower the temperature. Yeah.
Earlier this week, a colleague at the Washington Post reported today that an ICE memo allows agents to enter people's houses without a judge's warrant. What do you say to people who are concerned about this violating the Constitution, and how much is this tactic being used?
Yeah, so I saw that story, and the story is like so much that I read in the mainstream media. It's missing a whole lot of context, and when you appreciate the context, it makes sense. No one is saying, look, there are exceptions. For example, a crazy exception, if somebody is fired at from inside a house, they don't need a warrant to go inside that person's house. There are very narrow exceptions to the warrant requirement where law enforcement officers don't need a warrant if, for example, they're an imminent threat of their lives. But what we've said and what ICE has proposed, what the Department of Homeland Security really has proposed in the Department of Justice, is that we can get administrative warrants to enforce administrative immigration law. Now, it's possible, I guess, that the courts will say no, and of course, if the courts say no, we would follow that law, but nobody is talking about doing immigration enforcement without a warrant. We're talking about different types of warrants that exist in our system. Typically what happens, not always, but typically in the immigration system, those are handled by administrative law judges, so we're talking about getting warrants from those administrative law judges, and then of course, with other cases, you get judges, or you get warrants from a judge. That's very consistent with the practice of American law. I'm sure the courts will weigh in on that, but we're never going to enter somebody's house without some kind of a warrant, unless, of course, somebody's firing on an officer or they have to do something in order to protect themselves.
Follow up on that. Do you believe that you can forcibly enter with an administrative warrant, or would that be a violation of the Fourth Amendment?
Well, our understanding is that you can enforce the immigration laws of the country under an administrative order if you have an administrative warrant. That's what we think. That's our understanding of the law. That's our best faith attempt to understand the law. Again, this is something courts will weigh in on. I won't speak to that. But yes, most immigration law in our country is not done through the criminal system with the judge. It's done through the administrative law system. We're going to continue that practice just as they did in the Biden administration or any other administration.
Was there anything that you heard or saw today that would cause you to counsel the president to invoke the Insurrection Act? And then also, did you meet or talk to the ICE agent who was involved in the Renee Good incident?
I did not talk to him today. I talked to some of his colleagues. Your question on the Insurrection Act is interesting. I've tried to understand this as well as I possibly could. And my understanding is what the Insurrection Act, what invoking the Insurrection Act would allow the federal government to do is that it would allow the federal government to use the military for local law enforcement operations. Right now, we don't think that we need that. Now, the president could change his mind. Of course, things could get worse. But right now, we think that federal law enforcement officers can do the job of federal law enforcement. Now, what I do worry about, again, is if the chaos gets worse, if more and more ICE agents start getting assaulted, if other law enforcement officers start getting assaulted, that would be a real problem. But again, we have so much federal law enforcement resources here right now. We have so many people here that we do not want to have here. I do not want so many ICE officers in Minneapolis right now. I mean, good Lord, it's really, really freaking cold outside. But they're here not even to enforce immigration laws, but to protect the people from the rioters. That's an absurd state of affairs, and we wouldn't need it if we had a little bit more cooperation from the Minneapolis Police Department. Again, the Minneapolis Police Department, my understanding is that the actual beat cops on the ground, they would love to help out, but they're being told by somebody, I don't know if it's Mayor Frey, they're being told by somebody not to cooperate at all. What kind of a person tells their local police don't protect somebody if they're being assaulted by a rioter? It's crazy, and it's got to stop. Yes.
Earlier this week, local law enforcement accused federal agents of racial profiling. Why are there so many U.S. citizens being caught up in this operation?
Well, I think your question assumes something that's not necessarily in evidence, which is that when there are American citizens who have been caught up in some of these enforcement operations, very often it is people who have assaulted a law enforcement officer. They're not being arrested because they violated the immigration laws. They're being arrested because they punched a federal law enforcement officer. That is a totally reasonable thing. Now, to the accusation of racial profiling, look, it's something that we take very seriously. We will take accusations of racial profiling back to Washington. We'll certainly look into them as they come up. But this is not a group that's going around and looking for people who violated the law based on skin color. They're looking for people who violated the actual law, the law of our immigration system in this country. And so long as we had more cooperation, I think they could do these things in a much more targeted way. They would actually know where some of the bad guys are. I mean, again, you hear things that are hard to believe, but I've confirmed that they are true. Sex offenders who we're trying to get off the streets, who the local officials won't tell us their last known address. So then the local officials say, oh my God, these guys are doing widespread targeted enforcement operations when in reality, we would love to just go to one house. The local officials won't tell us which one house to go to.
Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, to that question, the local police chiefs have said their own off-duty officers, so police officers, are being targeted because they are a person of color and asked to show their papers. Is that a concern of the administration and the Department of Homeland Security if local law enforcement says their own officers are being targeted and they described it as, quote, civil rights violations in our streets?
So I saw one story about this and one local police officer who said this. And look, certainly is it a concern? Absolutely. The first thing we have to figure out is whether it happened or not. And then if it happened, whether there is a good explanation or a bad explanation. And of course, if somebody violated the law, if somebody racially profiled, if somebody violated the rights of one of our fellow citizens, that is something we will take very seriously. What I also would say is that many of the most viral stories of the past couple of weeks have turned out to be, at best, partially true. So we want to try people based on reality, based on the truth, based on context. We're not going to prejudge people just because of viral social media story that turned out to be half false.
Mr. Vice President.
A quick question. About the roundtable you just had, I presume that happened. Did you invite anybody with an opposing point of view to get an idea of why people are upset here? And just as a quick follow-up,
Have you reached out to Governor Walz at all in an attempt to turn down the temperature?
So I haven't talked to Governor Walz on this particular trip. A number of members of our administration, I believe our chief of staff, spoke to the governor and has been in constant contact with his staff over the past week. We've been in my office in constant contact with people here on the ground in Minneapolis. There were certainly people at our roundtable with opposing views, and look, I don't even know, whether it's public, but yes, we met with people with opposing views here at the roundtable. I wanted to get a perspective from everybody, but also, of course, offer my opinion that with a little bit more cooperation, we could lower the chaos. We're going to keep on doing that. If Governor Walz wants to call me, we'll absolutely continue talking. I will say that my sense of this situation, having talked to these guys for a long time, is this is primarily a law enforcement issue. This is the Attorney General, this is the local mayor, this is all of the organs of local and state law enforcement. That's who we focus on, but we've certainly been in communication with the governor and his office as well.
Vice President.
Yeah.
So local law enforcement obviously hasn't been really helping out with the agents who've been assaulted repeatedly. What's the plan if nothing changes there here locally and this operation has attracted thousands of agents? Are there any plans to go to any other cities from here?
Well, right now we're focused on Minneapolis because that's where we have the highest concentration of people who have violated our immigration laws, and that's also, frankly, where we see the most assault of our law enforcement officers. I mean, our plan is very simple. If you assault a federal law enforcement officer, we're going to do everything that we can to put you in prison. It's very simple. And most of these protesters, as much as I may disagree with their politics, most of them have been peaceful, but a lot of them have not been peaceful. And if you go and storm a church, if you go and insult a federal law enforcement officer, we're going to try very hard. We're going to use every resource of the federal government to put you in prison. Respect people's rights. Respect people's rights to worship. Respect people's rights to do their job without being assaulted. If you follow that basic principle, the Trump administration is doing everything that we can to protect your rights. But if you go after somebody, if you assault somebody, if you make a 9-year-old girl cry because you walked into her church and harassed her, we're going to go after you with every single tool that we have.
Vice President.
Yeah.
You guys spoke with NBC News, sir. Your administration has said repeatedly this is about safety, about making Americans feel safer. So what do you say to people here in Minnesota who say it's the overwhelming presence of ICE officers and federal officers and their tactics that are making them feel less safe?
Well, one thing I would say is, first of all, we saw in 2025 the biggest one-year drop in murders in the history of the United States of America. Significant reductions in violent crime. The reason why we have less violent crime is really two reasons. Number one, because we're enforcing the immigration laws and getting very violent criminals out of our country. And number two, because we're enforcing our criminal laws and putting guys who assault and murder behind bars. This is part of a broad effort to make us safe. And the chaos that people are seeing, and I understand there is frustration of the chaos, I'd say that we're doing everything that we can to lower the temperature, and we would like federal and local, state and local officials to meet us halfway. So much, so.
Are you saying that they're not perceiving it correctly? Are you saying that they're not seeing that it's the tactics or the presence of the officers that are
Look, I'm sure that people are seeing a lot of things that would make any member of our national community feel very upset, but I also think that if you understand this in context, this is the inevitable consequence of a state and local government that have decided that they're not going to cooperate with immigration enforcement at all. In fact, they're going to aggressively not cooperate. So here's a basic illustration of this. If you are an ICE officer and you have to arrest a person who's committed assault and is also an illegal alien, but the state and local officials won't help you identify that person, many of the things that people in Minneapolis are seeing that give them pause, that frustrate them, that worry them, that make them feel like things are too chaotic, many of these things are coming from the fact that there's no cooperation with state and local law enforcement. And I guess what I would tell people, again, many of whom are justifiably concerned and worried about what they're seeing in their communities is, why are we not seeing it anywhere else? We're seeing this level of chaos only in Minneapolis. LA and Chicago, we had some problems there. Pretty much every jurisdiction where these guys are operating, you don't see the same level of chaos. You don't see the same level of violence. You don't see the problems that we're seeing in Minneapolis. Maybe the problem is unique to Minneapolis, and we believe that it is. And it's the lack of cooperation between state and local law enforcement and federal law enforcement.
Mr. Vice President.
ICE has been operating here for years with less pushback than we're seeing right now. And even the St. Paul police chief recently said, is there not a way to find common ground without scaring the hell out of people in the community? Those are his words.
And I just wonder, with this Operation Metro Surge, is any part of it meant to send a form of political message to the leaders here in Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota? And I know you talked about you've been in touch with the governor's offices and the mayor's offices, but why have you not been able to speak to them directly? Have they not been willing to do so?
Well, look, I have spoken to some of the people in Minnesota directly. I spoke to some of them today. I've spoke to others in the past. And again, our staff has been in very direct contact with pretty much every official with any influence or any power in Minneapolis. But no, we're not trying to send a political message. We're trying to enforce the law. And unfortunately, what has happened is that as we've enforced the law, there's been this weird reaction, again, unique to this city. This is not a common thing across the United States of America. There's been a very unique, very Minneapolis-specific reaction to our enforcement of federal immigration laws. What I'm trying to do here today is understand why that is. What is it about Minneapolis that has become so chaotic? What are the specific types of cooperation that we need? Look, I don't need Tim Walz or Jacob Frey or anybody else to come out and say that they agree with J.D. Vance or Donald Trump on immigration. I just don't need that. What I do need them to do is empower their local officials to help our federal officials out in a way where this can be a little bit less chaotic and it can be a little bit more targeted. Like if we're trying to find a sex offender, tell us where the guy lives. Simple things like that, simple changes in how they're approaching immigration enforcement would make this work a lot better. It would make Minneapolis' streets a lot safer, and it would make this whole thing a lot less traumatic for this community. I'll take one more question.
Mr. Vice President. You've said that it's time to turn down the temperature. Does that include changes to both ICE and CBP tactics that we've seen employed on the streets, including less than lethal tactics, pepper spray, pepper balls? Beyond that, what is the federal government's role in turning down the temperature? And the Minnesota Department of Corrections says that its own officers have been cooperating with ICE all along, handing over criminals once they serve their sentences to ICE officials. Can you concede that there is some cooperation with the state?
Yeah, look, if I was going to list the 5 agencies locally and statewide that I'm most worried about, I wouldn't put the Department of Corrections on that list. I think that while there are certain things we'd like to see more from them, they've hardly been the worst offenders. You agree with that, guys? That's a fair assessment. But I think you talked about tactics and you talked about the response to things. Look, we don't want to employ tactics that we don't employ the kind of tactics that are only necessary when violence is committed against officers. That is these guys' directive, and that's what we're going to try to do. And again, the president said this a couple of days ago, whenever you have a law enforcement operation, even if 99.99% of the guys do everything perfectly, you're going to have people that make mistakes. That is the nature of law enforcement. What I do think that we can do is working with state and local officials, we can make the worst moments of chaos much less common, and all they've got to do is meet us halfway. These guys want to communicate with them. They want to talk to the local business leaders. Many of the people standing behind me are members of the Minneapolis community. Many of the officials that I met today who work in federal immigration enforcement, this is their home. They love this place. These are their neighbors. They want this to work a lot more smoothly. I think that we can get there. We just got to work at it a little bit, and we need some cooperation from state and local officials. The last thing that I'll say is I just hope they give it. This is a beautiful city. I've only been here a few times. I love it. Even in this weather, I love Minneapolis. We could do a lot better. We could do a lot more with more cooperation. The Trump administration, the directive that I got from the President of the United States is meet these guys halfway. Work with them so that we can make these immigration enforcement operations successful without endangering our ICE officers, and so that we can turn down the chaos a little bit, at least. I think a lot, actually. But for us to do that, we need some help from the state and local officials. We will keep on working with them, and so long as they're willing to work with us, they will always find a partner in public safety and law enforcement in the Trump administration. Thank you all.
And you were just watching Vice President J.D. Vance giving a speech saying that things in Minneapolis could go a lot more smoothly if local and state officials and leaders gave a little more cooperation. Joining us now to discuss is Gerard Filitti, Senior Counsel at the Lawfare Project and political strategist. So Gerard, thank you for joining us today. And I just want your comments on what Vice President J.D. Vance said. How much influence do local and state leaders have in terms of things going more smoothly and without chaos? For example, giving intelligence when ICE officers are trying to arrest what J.D. Vance said, sex offenders, and they wouldn't give them the address.
I think state and local officials have tremendous power to be heard by people who know them, people who interact with them on a routine basis, and they have, and probably they alone have the power to de-escalate a lot of the tension that we're seeing by calling for calm and restraint and asking people not to actively interfere with the law enforcement operations. People can still protest, but they shouldn't be encouraged to participate in these types of active demonstrations, actively interfering with law enforcement that has even caused the death of Renee Good. So I think that these local officials have a lot of responsibility here. And if anything, they shouldn't be directing people to confrontations. They should be de-escalating the situation.
Okay, now for some comments on our previous live stream of Jack Smith testifying at that hearing. So I want you to just give us the facts here of what Jack Smith did, his actions, the two cases. One that alleges Trump tried to overturn the 2020 election and mishandling of the classified documents. Just give us the facts here, and we can let our viewers decide whether his actions were just.
Well, what we saw today was a public version of the deposition that he already gave last month to Congress, to the Judiciary Committee. He laid out a case in which he thought that there was probable cause in order to start this investigation. And in the course of this investigation, based in part on testimony and witness statements, even from Republicans, that there was enough evidence to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump had committed a crime, that he had willful blindness to the fact that he lost the election, and that as a result of that, January 6th happened, the attempts to overthrow the election happened, in his opinion. And what we saw from the Republican side from questioning are questions whether he was properly authorized to conduct this investigation in the first place, as Judge Cannon concluded in Florida in federal court, and whether this investigation was actually biased and motivated by politics and not by the actual law. So really, it's hard. Well, I think what's been pointed out, it's very hard to prove intent, the type that Jack Smith wanted to bring to court, and that does raise questions on the comprehensiveness of the investigation.
Okay, what about Smith subpoenaing phone records of Republican members of Congress? Smith said he would have gotten Democrats' records if they were needed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think he made a point that is very valid from a legal perspective. He was looking for records that were relevant to his investigation, and those records were purportedly held by Republicans, that by phone records and logs that from phones that belonged to people who communicated with Donald Trump, and it was not Democrats who were communicating with President Trump at that time. That being said, there are problems and potential improprieties when you are looking to subpoena or to get phone records of government, because you do have that deliberations clause. You do have those constitutional protections for members of Congress to engage in government without being investigated by the Justice Department or by anyone else. So that is a tension within the law that has yet to be resolved.
Okay, what about the timing of these cases? Smith signaled that he would have brought the charges even if Trump was a Democrat. But, you know, it was the timing that a lot of conversation are being had about the legitimacy. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the timing was very interesting, and he proceeded with his investigation fairly quickly. Ultimately, the fact that this was convened so close to the election and that charges were brought with a trial date pending in January of 2024, as the election was approaching, and Donald Trump was the most likely Republican candidate. The timing of all of this was problematic, and I think some of the questioning we heard at the end about asking for a trial date 5 or 6 months after the indictment, which basically would mean that defense lawyers would have to read 7,000 pages a minute in order to fully comprehend all the evidence that was collected, was just not realistic. So that does make it look to some that Jack Smith was rushing this to get this before a jury, to get this before the court of public opinion before the election, and not taking time to allow the defense to work their case.
What is your analysis on the constitutionality of the appointment of Jack Smith? We heard some Republicans say that he wasn't appointed by Congress.
Well, I think procedure matters, and the way that he executes his office, whether he was appointed properly or not, is a very important thing. And as Judge Cannon has already ruled in federal court in Florida, there was the issue that under the law that he was appointed special special counsel, normally that's a position that's confirmed by the Senate, and he didn't have that Senate confirmation. So I think that that was an important decision by Judge Cannon that we heard more about today. And in fairness to Jack Smith, he may have been operating under the assumption that he was properly appointed, but there do seem to be very legitimate questions about whether the proper procedure was followed. And when we have a prosecution or a potential prosecution of a former president, procedure certainly matters.
Okay, can you also talk to us about whether Smith's testimony today could impact the ongoing Hatch Act probe opened by the Office of Special Counsel last summer?
I think it could certainly impact the investigation. I don't see the investigation going away. I think that they will want to see more documents, more evidence, and conduct that investigation more thoroughly. I don't think that his testimony today puts to rest any of those questions. But ultimately, this is all about the evidence and following what conversations were had and who those conversations were had with, and to the extent that the special counsel's office or Jack Smith himself had discussions with elected officials that were beneficial for their campaigns or for their political positioning, that is deeply problematic.
Okay, just finally, Gerard, if you could just list for us maybe a couple of outcomes that you see could play out for Smith, based on everything that's happened so far, today's hearing, and anything else.
Well, I don't think that there is much that can happen to Smith, or for that matter to President Trump. The cases against him are, for all intents and purposes, dead and buried. Even though they were dismissed without prejudice, the statute of limitations will run by the time he is out of office, so those two prosecutions are effectively gone. As for Jack Smith, he does believe that he operated in accordance with the law and in accordance with Justice Department procedures. If Congress concludes otherwise, there's little they can do other than perhaps issue condemnations of this proceeding and try to formulate new rules, new processes, or a new law to hold the special counsel more accountable in this type of sensitive investigation.
All right, Gerard, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure, thank you.
President Trump reacting to Jack Smith's hearing today. In a Truth Social post, Trump says he wants the Justice Department to act. Trump's post reads, "Hopefully, the Attorney General is looking at what he's done, including some of the crooked and corrupt witnesses that he was attempting to use in this case against me. The whole thing was a Democrat scam. A big price should be paid by them for what they have put our country through." The president accused Smith of unfair prosecution, saying he destroyed many lives and shouldn't be allowed to practice law. Smith's two cases against Trump largely fell apart by mid-2024. He dropped the cases after Trump won the election. The former special counsel resigned days before Trump took office and has not faced any charges. The activist who allegedly organized an anti-ICE protest during a church service in St. Paul has been arrested. FBI Director Kash Patel says she has been charged with violating the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. Bondi announced the arrest of Nikki Levy Armstrong after protesters stormed a church during a Sunday service. Organizers said the church's pastor works for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as the FACE Act. The law in part prohibits the obstruction or threat of force to intimidate or interfere with a person seeking to participate at a house of worship. Bondi also announced the arrest of an employee of the St. Paul Board of Education. Former CNN anchor turned YouTuber Don Lemon live-streamed the incident and questioned the church's pastor. The DOJ's Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights suggested that Lemon's behavior also violated the FACE Act and that Lemon was, quote, on notice. Meanwhile, Attorney General Pam Bondi announced on X that a third person is arrested in Minnesota church attack. William Kelly is now in custody. Bondi says William Kelly is being charged with conspiracy to deprive rights, a federal crime, and violating the FACE Act for his involvement in the St. Paul church riots. The Department of Homeland Security says it has arrested over 10,000 illegal aliens in Minnesota over the past year. ICE's Executive Assistant Director of Enforcement and Removal Operations had more to say about the department's ongoing efforts, dubbed Operation Metro Surge.
It's easy to debate immigration enforcement when it's abstract, but behind every one of these arrests is someone who committed a crime that put your friends, family, neighbors, community in danger. The public deserves to know exactly who ICE has taken off the streets and why we're here today. It's my responsibility to make sure everyone understands that ICE is only in this state to pick up the ball that local leadership has dropped. Today, I want to ask Governor Walz and Mayor Fry directly, please honor our immigration detainers.
During today's press conference, ICE provided details about some of the individual agents have apprehended. One of those arrested is an alleged MS-13 gang member and registered sex offender with a final order removal from 2021. That individual had been deported 4 times and allegedly attempted to grab an officer's gun during his arrest. Immigration agents also arrested an individual from St. Lucia with 11 criminal convictions, including larceny and stolen vehicle offenses. Another illegal alien taken into custody had a conviction for second-degree murder. In addition to the arrests, Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino discussed the effect rioters were having on immigration enforcement operations.
Let's take a look at what happened yesterday. Some of you may know that Border Patrol and ICE were out conducting our Title 8 mission, and several of our teams were set upon by violent protesters, anarchists, rioters, individuals, and extremists that were intent on ensuring that we did not take these very people that Marcos talked about off the streets. Intent that we would not arrest these individuals, these illegal aliens that prey upon mom and pop America every single day.
Bovino also criticized local Minneapolis police for failing to stop individuals from impeding ICE operations. Bovino added that he believed Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry were allowing and emboldening rioters to harass and attack ICE agents. Meanwhile, House Republicans advanced a $1 trillion spending package. The legislation would include funding for ICE amid ongoing immigration enforcement operations. The House is expected to vote on 2 separate government funding packages today, after the bills cleared their first hurdle in the House Rules Committee earlier in the day. One bill would fund the War, Education, Labor, and Health and Human Services departments. The second would cover funding for the Department of Homeland Security, including ICE. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and other Democrats have said they will oppose the Homeland Security bill. Connecticut Representative Rosa Delario, the ranking Democrat on the House Appropriations Committee, said, quote, "There's a very big concern about ICE being out of control. Congress faces a January 30th deadline to pass 12 spending bills or another stopgap measure to keep the government open." President Trump reacting to Jack Smith's hearing today. In a Truth Social post, Trump says he wants the Justice Department to act. Trump's post reads, "Hopefully the Attorney General is looking at what he's done, including some of the crooked and corrupt witnesses that he was attempting to use in his case against me. The whole thing was a Democrat scam. A big price should be paid by them for what they have done to our country." The president accused Smith of unfair prosecution, saying he destroyed many lives and shouldn't be allowed to practice law. Smith's 2 cases against Trump largely fell apart by mid-2024. He dropped the cases after Trump won the election. The former special counsel resigned days before Trump took office and has not faced any charges. The U.S. is set to officially exit the World Health Organization today after President Trump gave notice on the first day of his presidency in 2025 via an executive order. Joining us now to discuss this is Reggie Littlejohn, founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers and a human rights advocate. Reggie, thank you so much for joining us today. So what was going through your mind initially when you first heard this move by President Trump?
Oh, well, I had gone to D.C. for the inauguration, and I expected him to keep his promise to withdraw from the WHO. I was really surprised and obviously thrilled that he did it on his first day in office, just within hours of the inauguration. So it was a moment of great triumph and jubilation for those of us who had worked so hard to help bring that day about.
Okay, maybe you can dive a bit deeper into exactly why you were feeling these emotions. What are the motivating factors that led to you feeling this way?
As you know, I began with Women's Rights Without Frontiers fighting forced abortion in China. When the World Health Organization started following China's lead on COVID, I saw that basically that they were installing a network of vaccine passports, which could serve as the same platform as the China social credit system, which would put the entire world in a situation of mass surveillance and totalitarian control. They also mimicked China's lies, that there was no human-to-human transmission. They followed China's lead in terms of lockdowns, vaccine mandates, mask mandates. They basically botched the entire COVID response and arguably caused many lives all over the world. And so then their result, what they wanted for that is they were like, well, we didn't have enough power. So they did these amendments to the international health regulations, this pandemic treaty to give themselves more power. And it was time to get out. I mean, Trump cited the corruption of the Chinese Communist Party having an outsized influence on the World Health Organization, their botched COVID. Also, I would say this whole push towards digital IDs is something that is extremely dangerous. And then they have this new thing called the Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System, where they are encouraging countries, instead of to quarantine off the deadly pathogens that they might find in their jungle or in their swamp, to send them to the World Health Organization. And then the World Health Organization will then farm them out to labs all over the world, ostensibly to make vaccines. But what this does is it greatly increases the chances of lab leaks and even bioterrorist attacks. There is no prohibition against gain of function in the pandemic treaty. And so I am absolutely jubilant that the United States now has officially withdrawn, and I would encourage other countries to consider doing the same.
So you talk about China's influence in the WHO. Do you think public perception and world leaders' perception took a more critical view right after the pandemic and what you described about China's influence?
I think that it became obvious to anyone who had eyes to see that that China, for example, really restricted the way that the World Health Organization could even investigate whether this was a lab leak. China's line was, this is not a lab leak. It was, the Wuhan wet market, pangolin or a bat. And then what the World Health Organization did is it shut, and also governments and social media shut down people who disagreed with that, calling it misinformation and disinformation, when actually now it turns out that that is likely what happened. And this is another problem with the World Health Organization that is similar to the Chinese Communist Party, is that is this regime of censorship. The pandemic treaty requires governments to prevent misinformation and disinformation. It means you don't even censor it afterwards. You prevent it from coming out to begin with. This is very CCP-like and very dangerous for the world.
So, Reggie, the U.S. was the main funder of the WHO, contributing around 18% of its overall funding. What's going to happen for the organization without that money?
Well, first of all, okay, so we withdrew our funding. That's a huge financial hit for them. Other organizations have stepped up. Some governments have stepped up, but they have not been able to replace the funding by the United States. And what that would mean to me is that it signals to the World Health Organization that, in fact, the world does not value its services as much as they think it should. But the United States has said that we want to collaborate bilaterally with other countries, and so that if a country wants to coordinate with us, I'm sure that we will help them, not through the WHO but directly. So I don't think that we're just leaving the world in a state of pandemic unpreparedness or whatever, but we just want to be able to direct our actions and our funding as a sovereign nation.
Yeah, you're right about that. And I just want to build on it because the U.S. and Argentina, they've announced that they're going to create an alternative international health system separate from the World Health Organization. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure if that's going to be an actual structure. The problem with creating another structure like the World Health Organization is that if it's successful, it's just going to get infiltrated the way the World Health Organization did. So I'm not sure it's going to be another structure or whether it's just going to be bilateral, ad hoc negotiations. Somebody has a problem, the United States, can work with them to help their problem, and not necessarily through another organization.
Okay, just one final question, Reggie. You know, the U.S. has a number of allies. They don't necessarily always follow suit in what the U.S. does. But do you think other countries may follow in the footsteps of the U.S. in leaving the WHO?
Well, I know I spoke recently at the Israeli Knesset. I know that they are discussing it. And I'm going to be going to Europe next month and speaking to parliaments, hopefully all over Europe about issues like this, trying to encourage people to really think about, does it make sense to stay in this corrupt and ineffective World Health Organization?
Okay, Reggie, really great to speak with you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
President Trump taking action against New York Times Siena poll. It's among the leading political pollsters in the nation. In a post on Truth Social today, the president said the New York Times and many others are printing polls that are knowingly false. He said these polls gave him fake low numbers despite his achievements on the economy and border security. Trump's legal action came after the New York Times released a poll earlier today. It showed 49% of respondents saying Trump's second term made the country worse, with just 32% saying it made the country better. The president wrote, quote, "They have to pay a price for fake and fraudulent news, and hopefully, in the not-too-distant future, they will." Another legal action coming out of the White House today. President Trump is suing J.P. Morgan Chase and its CEO, Jamie Dimon. Trump alleged that the financial institution debanked him for political reasons and is seeking a $5 billion compensation. The president and his business organizations had banked with J.P. Morgan Chase for decades. In the weeks following the January 6th Capitol breach, the bank notified Trump that his accounts will be closed within 2 months, and he will have to move hundreds of millions of dollars. The president said the bank did so with no provocation and offered no remedy. The lawsuit also alleged J.P. Morgan Chase put Trump on a blacklist and did so due to the political tide at the time. The banking giant responded earlier after Trump first threatened a lawsuit last week, saying, quote, "We agreed that no one's account should be ever closed because of political or religious beliefs. We appreciate that this administration has moved to address political debanking, and we support those efforts." There's good news for the economy. First-time unemployment benefit applications from last week remained near 2-year lows. The Bureau of Labor Statistics pegs them at around 200,000. That's up 1,000 from the previous week, but it still keeps the 4-week average in the lowest in the 2 years. Claims continue to hover around 4-year highs. Also, the third and final revision of last quarter's GDP adjusts it up from 4.3% of 4.4%. That's the fastest pace of growth in 2 years. The biggest nurses' strike in New York City history is headed into week number 2. According to the nurses' union, this week's renewed discussions come at the urge of Governor Kathy Hochul and Mayor Zohran Mamdani, both Democrats. NTD's Sean Marshall has more.
We are out here because we need a fair contract now.
The biggest nurse strike in New York City history is in renewed discussions this week. According to the nurses' union, the urging of high-level New York politicians played a big role. Several nurses described conditions inside hospitals like being routinely assigned too many patients, making it impossible to provide adequate monitoring and individualized care, which nurses say puts patients at risk.
We're encouraging everyone to return to that bargaining table. Too often, when we see a strike, people forget that that is not where workers want to be. A strike is an act of last resort. What workers want is to be back at work. So what this will mean is making that possible. And so we call on every side to come back to that negotiating table. Have a swift and urgent resolution.
Jonathan Hunter, a grievance chair at Mount Sinai Morningside, said workplace violence has become a growing concern, arguing nurses should not fear being attacked on the job or be forced to act as security. Hospitals say the union is seeking unrealistic and unaffordable pay raises. Mount Sinai called the request extreme, and Montefiore called them reckless. New York Presbyterian said the union called the strike to create disruption, but said it's ready to keep negotiating a, quote, fair and resolvable contract.
I
shouldn't be out here begging for my health care. You all shouldn't be out here begging for your health care. We should be back at the bedside where we want to be.
The hospitals also state that they aren't proposing to cut nurses' healthcare benefits, as the nurses' union contends. Sean Marshall, NTD News.
A New York judge has ordered a Republican-held congressional district to be redrawn, ruling its current boundaries unconstitutional. The ruling targets New York's 11th congressional district on Staten Island, the city's only Republican seat. It's currently held by Congresswoman Nicole Maliotakis. The judge yesterday barred future elections under the current map and ordered the state's redistricting commission to act quickly. 4 New York voters filed a lawsuit last October arguing the district lines dilute the voting power of Black and Latino residents on Staten Island. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who represents Brooklyn, praised the judge's ruling, calling it the first step toward ensuring communities of interest remain intact. But the New York GOP chair, Ed Cox, called it a bipartisan, or rather, a partisan ruling made by a partisan judge. The ruling comes as Democrats and Republicans vie for control of the House heading into the 2026 midterm elections. President Trump said the United States is negotiating an arrangement to secure full access to Greenland. We discussed this with the foreign policy and national security analyst after this break.
That truly matters for each and every one of us. This is what you've been waiting for. See it at least once in your lifetime. Shen Yun. Get tickets now at shenyun.com.
A massive winter storm is set to sweep across the U.S., threatening millions with heavy snow and ice and making travel extremely dangerous. Officials warn the storm will stretch from the southwest all the way to the northeast. NTD's Christina Corona has the latest.
A major winter storm will stretch nearly 2,000 miles from the Arizona-New Mexico border to New England, affecting about 230 million people. The storm is set to begin Friday in Texas and Oklahoma, where officials warn conditions could turn treacherous after sunset. Texas Governor Greg Abbott enacted a disaster declaration covering 134 counties across the state ahead of the storm.
The top 2/3 of the state of Texas, maybe from San Antonio all the way up to the tip top of the Panhandle, will be the worst hit.
Abbott said protecting lives is the top priority, warning that icy roads can be nearly invisible and cause drivers to lose control of their vehicles.
What we strongly encourage is, if you're in an area with this ultra cold temperature that also has precipitation, do not be on the road unless you have to be on the road. You can save your own life and save your own property and save those around you.
Georgia Governor Brian Kemp says residents should start preparing for the storm now.
But this is a good time to start preparing for this weekend should that happen. If you need batteries, food, gas in your vehicles and other things, just got plenty of time. Be winter weather aware. Know that we'll be messaging the rest of the week, working with our state and federal partners on the weather forecast.
And New York Governor Kathy Hochul warns that the storm could bring deadly cold.
If you're in the North Country, Mohawk Valley, what it'll feel like on your skin is minus 40 to 50 degrees.
She says other upstate areas will be a little warmer with feel-like temps of minus 30 degrees and downstate minus 5 to 10 degrees.
And when this touches your skin, if you're not properly covered every inch of you, you can succumb to frostbite in seconds.
Authorities nationwide are urging people to prepare now and avoid unnecessary travel. The National Weather Service warns that widespread travel disruptions are expected. Christina Corona, NTD News.
Next, we have NTD's International Figure Painting Competition, where the mission is to promote traditional skills of figure painting and to lead people to appreciate divinely inspired art and culture. This week, 60 finalists' works are on display in New York City, and organizers have arranged various cultural activities for the participants. NTD's Flora Hua brings us the story.
The finished painting is certainly beautiful in its own right, but the process of creating it can be even more engaging and satisfying to watch. The competition's committee organized a live painting event where 2 painters demonstrate their skills right here at the Samangundi Club. Let's take a look.
Painting here in this event, it's just beautiful, all of the people that are here observing and talking with us.
Nick Anikis is a professional painter from Slovenia. He has studied at 2 academies of fine arts, one in Slovenia and one in Italy. He shared his insights on the significance of high-level skills for an artist.
Well, if you don't know how to speak the language, you cannot write and read poetry. Sometimes people have amazing ideas, but if they don't know how to paint it or how to realize it, they won't touch people, they won't move people.
Kenneth Young shared that his understanding of beauty is rooted in his faith.
For me personally, what I feel is a standard of beauty, since I believe in an ultimate, all-wise, intelligent creator who is the one that is the creator of the universe and man and everything. So the standard, there has to be some objective, high, overarching standard, and I believe it comes from the creator. My standard of beauty, it's similar to what Michelangelo said. Michelangelo said something like, but basically what an artist, he was a sculptor and a painter, strives for is for the divine. The closest he comes to the divine, that is the standard of perfection and of beauty. That's the way Michelangelo looked at it. And I think that's the way I look at it too.
This is the second time Taiwanese painter Pan Liang-tai has participated in NTD's international figure painting competition. He said he agrees with the competition's mission of bringing back traditions and classical arts.
NTD TV advocates a return to traditional art. Traditional art means guiding people back to the kind of grand, magnificent works we see in the world's classical masterpieces.
Kathy Smith bought the painting Widow's Mite about 2 years ago, and she was going to donate the painting to a campus. When she saw the advertisement of this competition, she had an idea.
I'm a longtime subscriber of the Epoch Times and watch NTD News and American Essence magazine, so I'm familiar. That's my news source, my favorite news source. So when I saw the advertisement for it, I just passed that on to the artist and his wife and said, you should look into this. And they applied, they submitted this painting and another one too, and they were accepted, and we're just thrilled. We're just so honored to be here.
I'm just so humbled, especially after coming here and seeing the collection of beautiful work and other amazing artists. It's really a humbling experience.
Most important part for me is that I can be, in a way, a small little tiny bit of the whole mission that you have here. Because the mission is not just creating beautiful artwork, but it's so much more, like fighting for freedom, fighting for beauty, that making this world a better place through art, because I think art, in a way, has the power to speak directly with our hearts.
On Thursday, the winners of different award categories will be announced, and on Friday, artists will go on a trip to New York City's Met Museum to appreciate works with the competition committee. Flora Hua, NTD News.